Chapter 13 Silver Tongue. The wellspring was beautiful, and Song Lan gently lifted Xingzhen's hand to tell him, relieved to see the tension gently smoothed from his face, drawing out a small smile. There are several small waterfalls running down the cliff face into a deep pool, ferns and moss on the cliffs. The water is blue and clear, it catches the sunlight. "I can hear it," Xingzhen said, smile warmer. "And the birds and the breeze in the trees. It sounds like a very peaceful place. Let's stop and rest here for a while." Xu Yang had already thrown himself down to sit on a protruding rock near the water, giving their entwined hands a look of blackest hatred. But after his last words on the road, because of course he had to get the last words in, he had stayed completely silent. "Look at his face," Song Lan had angrily written in the dust as Xingzhen faltered, pale and shaking. "You're tearing him apart." Luckily, that had been enough. No further violent intervention needed. Xu Yang had given Xingzhen one look, briefly wide-eyed, as though the pain on that anguished blindfolded face hadn't been apparent before, and stepped away, lips pressed together and hand clenching. Ignoring the man's glowering now, Song Lan led Xingzhen past him to the pool of clear water, finally letting go of his hand to let him drink, wash the road dust off his face. Thankfully, he just looked tired and contemplative, nothing worse, no red stains bleeding through the blindfold. Once he was done, falling still, Song Lan touched his fingertips with his own, and Xingzhen let him linger for a few moments of breathless tenderness before lifting his hand to listen. Small drops of water still beading on his skin, catching the sunlight. "Do you still want to meditate?" he traced lightly. "The mountains, sky and water converge here. It's a place with strong spiritual energy." Xingzhen gave him one of those smiles that softened his entire face, radiant. "I think I would like that." Song Lan carefully picked a perfect spot in the dappled shade, on soft grasses where the view opened up between the trees to show the jagged mountains and valleys below. Xingzhen might not be able to see the beauty of the landscape, but the flow of spiritual energy was pleasantly balanced here, soothing, even lack of eyesight aside. Xingzhen settled lightly at his side, the gentle breeze playfully toying with his hair. And then, unbelievably, he half turned over his shoulder to address the sullen Xu Yang. "Would you like to meditate with us?" Going by the dark look on the man's face up until now, Song Lan expected a derisive laugh or angry tantrum, but surprisingly he just hesitated briefly, face unreadable, before getting up and walking over, sitting down at Xingzhen's other side. Very much not a presence he welcomed into the peaceful scene, but he wasn't going to upset Xingzhen by contesting his impulsive invitation now. At least Xu Yang had the sense to remain quiet, mimicking Xingzhen's pose with disconcerting familiarity, back straight and eyes closed. He even managed to look deceptively peaceful. With Xingzhen keeping calm vigil at his side, he could probably be counted upon not doing anything too disruptive or violent. Probably. It was still with great mistrust that Song Lan finally gave in and closed his eyes as well. But Xingzhen was a familiar presence at his side, something radiant, even when unseen, and he both ached and marveled with it, the rightness of having him there. The breeze swept up from the valley below, a scent of sun-warm grass and forests, gently taking the edge of the afternoon sun, soothing the world calm. The small waterfalls filled the air with soft whispers, reciting the mantras of the universe, of being one with all his greatness, a small piece laid in place alongside the millions of others, of just being here and now in this moment of tranquility. And for a bittersweet moment the world was at peace. If forced to choose between stinging bitter elixirs and mind-numbingly tedious meditation to help recover his Qi, Xu Yang would definitely pick the former, always preferring a nastier but briefer pain to outdrawn boredom. But even in the past, Xiao Xingjin had an equally amusing and annoying habit of setting time aside for deep contemplation, sitting still, doing little more than breathing. Both him and Ah Jing had found the practice rather pointless, alike in restlessness, though of course they had always ended up humoring their Daozhang in the end. Another of many, many mundane things he hadn't realized he would actually miss until... He tensed at the sound of approaching voices, concentration broken, instantly snapping back into the present to fire a hostile glare at the rather large company of people coming up the hill toward the springs. Not a surprising intrusion, the road was usually well traveled, but an annoyance all the same. The moment was broken, and beside him both the Dao Shi blinked away as well, torn from their meditation. Frustrating. While the company of a noisy crowd was deeply unwanted, he quickly scrawled through valid reasons not to get back on the road quite yet, none of which would hint at weakness or the need for further rest. As luck would have it, the subject was broached for him. A few of the travelers approached, bowing humbly, whining something about bringing someone sickly along, headed to seek medical help in Tanzhou, asking the kind Dao Shi for healing talismans to help alleviate their suffering along the way. Xiao Xingjin clearly couldn't draw talismans anymore, being blind, and that could have meant him staying at his side while Song Lan shambled off to perform the good deeds of the day. But of course the worthless man couldn't speak, and had to drag Xiao Xingjin along with him just to handle conversation. Useless. Grinding his teeth, trying and failing to hold on to any G-recovering serenity mustered, he finally used his teeth to pull at his arm wrap, shaking the contents out of the hidden Tianquan pockets. There should still be a carefully hoarded apple in there, somewhere, with everything else. A few silver divination coins scattered onto the grass, always handy for a number of spells, could be used as payment in a pinch. Alongside a couple of potentially useful long needles the good doctors hadn't hidden well enough. Pilfered inkstone and a brush, a small scrap of paper, the polished red apple, still pristine, and not much more. Going through the pockets one-handed was a ridiculous ordeal in itself, both taking things out and putting them back, and of course all the really useful things had been in the right sleeve. Rotting upon his lost arm in the dust of Yi City, Jiangzai rusting beside it, the precious last piece of candy left behind in that bloody dirt somewhere. But he had always known, lesson well learned, you never got anything for nothing. Perhaps they'd been the payment due. A reasonable price for Xiao Xingjin's life back, all things considered. Xu Yang gave the apple a long, thoughtful look, inhaling a deep breath of the rich, sweet scent before scooping it back into the Tianquan pocket, alongside the paper, ink and brush. Maybe later. Had to hold the needles in his teeth to put them back without dropping them, and was reaching for the divination coins when a gaggle of onlookers curiously approached. "You're telling fortunes, worthy Daozhang?" A shy young woman with a few friends in Tao, and it took no imagination whatsoever to read the hopeful look on that blushing face. Apparently fate was kind enough to offer him some entertainment to make up for the rude interruption of their companionable afternoon meditation. He deployed his absolute most angelic smile. "Of course, dear child. All the mysteries of the universe are revealed to those who follow the great Tao. Won't you sit down?" Collecting the last divination coins from the grass, he jangled them once in his hand. "I think you should have a question about a certain someone, and your... yes, your happy future together." A few impressed gasps confirmed his guess, as he'd known they would. His smile grew wider. Fun. He'd gathered an audience of at least a dozen, paid generously in pastries, fruits, and the occasional small lump of silver for his brilliant divinations and altruistic words of wisdom by the time dusk started falling, and Song Lan came striding back over, face like a thundercloud. The man was probably able to smell out people having fun. unerringly interfering to put a stop to it. Ah, if this isn't my dear Daoyu, Song Daojang. He has taken a vow of silence in his piety. Don't mind the scowling face. He can't help it. An unfortunate circumstance of his birth. He's not really that mean. Song Lan's face twitched quite violently, and for a brief, fascinating moment he delighted in the thought of what would happen if the man lost control. Here, now, all that resentment unleashed among the innocent bystanders. Carnage, the most beautiful collateral damage. He knew well enough what his fierce corpse was capable of. But Xiao Xingjin would no doubt be upset. Regrettably, dearest friends, I think my Daoyu wishes to speak to me of the universe's mysteries in private. It's been a delight. Remember, love is a decision, not an emotion. They who obtain have little. They who scatter have much. Ah, yes, thank you. The journey is in itself the reward. Safe travels now. What do you think you're doing? Song Lan slammed into the ground, Fu Shui actually striking sparks. The moment the last of the travelers were reasonably out of sight. Laughing out loud and licking his teeth, Xu Yang picked out the most sugared sweet bun from his collection, biting into it with glee. Red bean and jujube filling. Nice. Good deeds, Song Daochan. The two of you were so busy, someone had to ease the worries of these poor people seeking spiritual guidance. He could have sworn Song Lan's eyes flickered all black for a moment, and the faintest of thrill trickled down his spine. Smiled wider to egg him on. Sugar and self-destruction, delicious in combination. Do you know the penalty for impersonating a Daoshi? I'm thinking you're about to tell me. There was an actual snarl at that, and he stuffed the rest of the sweet bun into his mouth, chewing a bit faster. It would be a waste being torn to pieces before getting to finish it. No, actually, now that you mention it, he continued before Song Lan could lift his sword to reply, swallowing, already reaching for the next treat. I do seem to have heard something about... Was it 80 lashes? That's not so bad. Will it be the horsetail whisk, or are you just going to break my jaw again 80 times? That actually seemed to stop the man rather than inciting him. Hopeless. You were the ones who gave me these ugly cotton cloth clothes to wear. You can't fault people for getting the wrong idea. You're taking advantage, Song Lan started writing, and he rolled his eyes. Believe it or not, posing as a righteous Daoshi won't last you all that long on the roads if you leave a trail of blood wherever you go. I may not have trained in some celestial temple on a mountaintop, but in those poor gullible people's eyes I could out-Daoshi someone like you without even trying. Another flicker of black in those slitted eyes, even a flash of teeth. You've done this before? You admit that? He laughed again, taking a bite out of a small plum, almost too tart after all the sweets. For years! Turns out it's a very handy way of getting around without arousing suspicion. I wish I'd thought of it much sooner. Ah, he interrupted as Song Lan's face contorted. Fu Shui lifted to stab at the ground again. Don't bother, you're just too slow. Let me guess. Bad, bad, Xu Yang. Lying is dishonorable. But I haven't lied, Song Daozhang. I just wear the clothes. It's not my fault people jump to conclusions. Horrible, Xu Yang. Baser than beasts. You corrupt the noble teachings by speaking them without proper indoctrination. Honestly, I read them. They are mostly pretentious bullshit. Fu Shui swept through the air to hover in front of his nose instead, and he laughed, delighted. Sore spot? Some of them are actually a bit funny, I'll give you that. Didn't you have something to say just now? You can't threaten me and talk at the same time. Such a dilemma. The second bite of the plum was a bit less tart, mouth cleansed of pure sugar, and he chewed in delight, looking up at Song Lan in anticipation. But the slow lout apparently couldn't make up his mind on whether to keep the sword pointed at him or lower it to speak. He sighed. You really are boring, aren't you? Not even good for a fight. Just a big, silent, useless lump of absolutely nothing. He tossed the plum pit over his shoulder and poked disappointedly at the sword with a fingertip, though gingerly, ready to snatch his hand back if it moved. Had no desire to lose the few fingers he had left. Never thought I'd say this, but I'm almost regretting cutting your tongue out. Having to actually put up with you like this is unbearable. That was apparently some sort of breaking point. Face a still stiff mask of rage, Sunglan firmly reached down and grabbed his collar, hoisted him to his feet and dragged him away towards the campfires, away from his treasure trove of sweets. Comforting himself with a triumph at the usually so aloof Dao Shi's unbecoming fury, Xu Yang burst into laughter again. Now, haven't you heard, Song Daozhang? He giggled unsteadily, hauled along in unceremonious jerks. Treat those who are kind with kindness, but also treat those who are not kind with kindness. Only thus is kindness obtained. Ow! Even with the constant flow of qi directed to heal it, his right shoulder was still in agony, and the grip on his collar had tugged unpleasantly at it. He laughed louder. What are the good travelers going to say, seeing the noble Song Daozhang manhandle a fellow Daoyu like this? Aren't you dishonoring your creed now? That did make the man falter, if only for a moment, then decisively make a wide detour around the campfires, off to the side to a smaller one, where a white-clad figure rested. Half walking, half dangling in that vice-like grip, Xu Yang kept laughing right up until he was close enough to see the unhappy look of disappointment on Xiao Xingden's face. He could feel the strong resentment of Zichen's rage from some distance, Shuanghua shuddering with it, accompanied a few moments later by the echo of that horrible laughter, undeniably Xu Yang, at his most spiteful and cruel. There had been a blessed ethereal moment before, with them both at peace at either side of him, a moment of regained stillness, edges blunted, dust settling after the clash on the road. Wishful thinking that it could last. Likely wishful thinking it had been there in the first place. What happened? Xiao Xingden asked, weary as the two of them reached the small campfire. At least Xu Yang had stopped laughing. Holding his hand up for Zichen to speak, he almost started at the vehemence of his touch, the agitation of his signs. Slower, please. I'm sorry, what was that? Drawing a deep breath, Zichen started over, fingers still quivering with anger, an almost unpleasant sting of resentment to his touch, buzzing, blurring the signs. Something about Xu Yang deceiving the other travelers, impersonating a master, making a mockery of the sacred teachings. Whatever he's saying, I didn't do anything wrong, Xu Yang interrupted defensively, dropping down to sit by the fire. He's making 9 whole cows out of a strand of hair as always. It was just a few harmless divinations. Please don't both talk at once, he said, trying and failing to concentrate on the strokes against his palm. Xu Yang gave an offended scoff, but did keep quiet. Zichen hesitated briefly, then finished the last strokes, hand somewhat calmer now. In the following silence, Xiao Xingden hesitated helplessly, not sure what they wanted him to do about anything. But no one was hurt? He asked again, to make sure. No, Xu Yang grumbled. I wasn't aware I was forbidden from talking to people. Shuanghua trembled again, and he heard a metallic sound, Fushe cutting the ground, writing signs he couldn't see. But I didn't. I simply didn't correct them, not the same thing. You should be pleased, having the precious words of the scriptures bestowed upon the common people. Hypocrites. You two do it all the time. He could all but feel the waves of resentment radiating from Zichen with his frustration. Another metallic sound, and Xu Yang drawing a breath to answer, no doubt to say something snide, making things worse. Why did you even bother coming over here if you're both going to keep talking over my head anyway? He said sharply, frowning, feeling unforgivably rude, and justified in his bitterness at once. I'm not, Xu Yang immediately deflected, accusing, even as Zichen hurried to take his hand again, gentler, tracing an apologetic, I'm sorry. It's been a very long day, and I'm very tired, he said, because when all else failed, that did tend to get their attention, and it was definitely not stretching the truth by much. The sickness they had been asked to help with had been caused by possession, and the needed exorcism and healing taking a heavy toll on his spiritual powers. Could we please just sit down for a quiet meal and then get some rest? We can discuss the rights and wrongs of clerical ethics tomorrow, when we're all not so tired and testy. Yes, Daojang, Xiang surrendered, complying tone lasting for all those 2 words before growing malicious again. I would have shared the sweets I was given, but someone dragged me away in a hurry. Xiang, please. A soft hiss, but then, surprisingly, an unrepentant but nonetheless unprompted, I'm sorry. He forced himself to give a tired half-smile, some sort of progress that, supposedly, though he could all but hear the eye-rolling exhale in the flippant tone. They all stayed uncomfortably silent as he handed out rations from his Qianquan bag, provisions generously given by the 2 doctors to keep them well fed for a while on the road. There was a hesitant touch at his wrist when they had finished eating, and he raised his hand to listen. You're angry. Did I upset you? No resentment remained. If anything, Zijin's touch was light and uncertain. No, I'm sorry if you thought so. None of this is your fault. I just feel so... When you're talking and I can see what you're saying, it's foolish, I know, but I feel so alone, so left out, left behind. Blind for real. I shouldn't have snapped like that. Please forgive me. Immediately, the light finger was replaced by Zijin's steady hand, grasping his own, giving a reassuring squeeze, endless fondness. I'm sorry, I didn't think. I remember to tell you what I'm saying in the future. He smiled gratefully. Thank you. They all remained silent around the crackling fire after that, a fragile truce at best, but he was grateful for that too. He was tired, and the sound of fire and waterfalls and distant hushed voices were humming a soothing lullaby. Yet when he lay down for that well-earned rest at last, it still took a long time for sleep to come. When it finally did, he dreamed of a precious familiar presence resting at each side of him, for a moment at peace, and the impossible fullness of it made his heart ache, even in sleep. The waterfalls glittered brightly in the early morning light, and with the other company having left for Tanzhou before dawn, the scene was quiet and tranquil. Song Lan allowed himself to linger in the solitude for a few moments longer than needed, gone to fetch water for the morning tea. That the place where Xingjin rested would be some place he hesitated to return was madness, though of course it wasn't Xingjin's presence that was the problem. There you are, I was looking for you. He felt the hair at the back of his neck rise, hackles up at the sound of that voice. Would Xingjin believe that Xu had taken an unfortunate step and drowned himself in the rock pool? Probably not, and it would be unfair to poison the water for future travelers. He turned around, making no attempt to hide the revulsion on his face. Xu either didn't notice or didn't care. Come here, I want to try something. He shouldn't have been surprised at being so casually summoned, like some dog. Shouldn't be surprised by any depths Xu would sink to by now, and yet it still astounded him. He deliberately slowly drew Fu Shui, for conversation or bloodshed, whichever would turn out more reasonably in the given moment. Xu stopped right in front of him, giving his face an assessing look. The hand holding Fu Shui twitched very lightly. It would be very, very easy. Then Xu held something up, catching the morning sun brighter than the water. One of the divination coins from the day before, the surface of its flat side scratched and uneven. Open your mouth. His incredulous fury must have shown on his face. Xu rolled his eyes, lolling his head back, ignoring the sword now pointed at him. Oh, would you not be contrary just for once? This will benefit you too. He tensed, felt his eyes go black, the world darker and more distant, like trying to look underwater. Xu just gave an exaggerated sigh, lowering his hand again. Song Daojang, you know I spent the last 7 years scouring the world for 2 kinds of spells. You should remember, you were left behind to guard his body every time I was away. Spells to raise the dead, make him human. That you should remember. I tried most of them on you." There was a horrible little smile at that, canines flushing, Xu Yang looking him up and down, seeming proud, like a twisted artist pleased with his good work. "You may not be quite as strong as the Ghost General, but that's all right. When it comes to passing for something living, you're far more advanced. You really are some of my best work. You ought to thank me." He laughed, but stopped when Fu Shui was swept up to rest against his neck, though the sharp smile lingered. Fine, be that way. The other kind of spell I collected were ways to speak with the dead. You're dead, and you seem to have some trouble speaking." He blinked, Fu Shui and the waves of resentment suddenly faltering. "Yes, I told you, you're unbearably boring like this. I want to see if this will work. So stop being annoying and do as I say. Open your mouth." Xu Yang held the silver coin up again, and he could see the scratches were actually small, roughly edged sigils. He hesitated, torn between a mad, hopeless desire for the prize dangling in front of him, a voice, and the knowledge rooted in his bones that this creature couldn't be trusted. "I'm growing bored with you for real," Xu Yang said, sighing, tossing the coin once and catching it again. "It won't hurt you. You need the metal to touch the brain for mind control. Don't be so squeamish." Every last nerve screamed in apprehension, but he just couldn't not. If it might... Unable to hold back a snarl, he forced himself to unclench his jaw, open his mouth. "There, that wasn't so hard, was it? Hold still, and don't swallow it. I don't want to have to listen to your undead indigestion." Xu Yang casually bit his own lip open and touched the coin to the blood, sigils flaring, then popped it between Song Lan's teeth before he could sputter in protest. Even in his dead mouth, he could somehow taste metal, desperately hoping it was the silver and not the iron tang of the blood, Xu Yang's blood. Xu Yang, who looked up at him with two bright eyes, expectant. "Say something." The coin was cold, lodged where the base of his tongue should be, and he tried to remember how to shape words, going with the first heartfelt feeling that came to mind. "Fuck you." Xu Yang's eyes lit up in absolute delight, and he laughed and laughed like a child given candy, elated. "Yes, and you even learned some new curses. I'm so proud of you, Song Daozhang." "You can hear me?" "Absolutely. You should try to hold it still. Stop slurring so bad. Usually it's supposed to be pinned to the tongue of the corpse, but you don't have one. I think we could stitch it to the inside of your cheek. That would help." Xu Yang thoughtfully reached up and tapped a finger at his jaw, as though Fu Shui wasn't still resting across his shoulder, edge against his neck. Song Lan recoiled from the absent-minded, too familiar touch, deeply disturbed. "We'll need silver thread. Maybe we can find some in the next town. Try lodging it between your teeth and cheek for now." "Don't touch me." There was a derisive scoff at that, but Xu Yang was still smiling. "Tch, ingrate. I'll be able to talk to Xingjin like this?" "Of course. You didn't think I was doing this for you, did you?" He held up another scratched coin on a piece of string, indicated an identical one around his own neck. "As long as he wears this, he'll be able to hear you. But..." He raised an admonishing finger, eyes wide and a smile stretched full of teeth, suddenly demonic. "I'm the master of the talisman. You can't use it to ever disobey me or speak ill of me." A cold fist knocked the air out of him for a moment, should have known it was a trap. And then he narrowed his eyes. "The very first thing I did was to tell you to go fuck yourself." Xu Yang burst into laughter again, still seemingly delighted, completely unbothered at having been caught in a lie. "Ah, remember that, did you? Damn. I'll just have to rely on your oh-so-noble nature and humble gratitude to keep you well behaved then." The smile faded, and he looked serious, tilting his head, giving him a thoughtful look before his gaze went distant, nodding along with his own words, as though saying them as much for his own benefit as Song Lan's. "It'll make him happy, I think. Make sure he won't feel left behind again. We can't make him upset like that. You'll have to help make sure he's not. He's still fragile." This was, without a doubt, the oddest conversation he'd ever had, Sung Lan concluded, head spinning, and not only because of the cold, hard silver in his mouth. With a sudden flick of his wrist, Xu Yang tossed the coin he was still holding at him, and he caught it on reflex, held it up by the string, mesmerized by the way it glittered in the sunlight, like a small slice of heaven itself, a promise. "Go talk to him," Xu Yang told him quietly, turning away, bitter, all smiles gone. "Make him happy. He's missed talking to you." With one last disconcerting look over his shoulder, Sung Lan turned his back on the monster who had ripped his life apart and hurried towards the small fire and the man he loved waiting there. Blooper. The hidden Tian-kun pockets. Tian-kun. Jiang Zai.